10 for a few minutes, all right? This is something, fifth period didn't do this yesterday, so I'm actually recording this because fifth period is very quiet, right? It's the smallest dual credit class, and they are super, super quiet. Plus, I always joke they're the guinea pigs. This is the first dual credit class I have, so when I'm seeing how things work, right, they're always the first ones I try things out on. So, bless their hearts, right? It's hard to be the oldest child, I guess. So anyway, so let's take a look at.
There's a live.
Oh, I was like, Rachel, I don't think you're the oldest child. What the? Because I got her brother, right? Right, Nathan's your brother, not your cousin.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, that's right. Oh gosh, that's right. Okay, so Mary Kate's Jacob. So you're still not the oldest.
Yeah. You have the right brothers. Yeah. The brothers fit.
Okay, there you go. Names, right? Me and names. I'm telling you. Well, that's okay. Regular and honors, they were doing mug breakers, and I got Jacob Rees and John Muir confused, and so it was Jacob Muir, and yeah. So, anyways, they were like, "There's not a Jacob Muir." I'm like, "John Muir." They're like, "You have Jacob Muir written down." So yeah, so it's not just students I have this problem with. Okay, not good with names. It's a sociological development. Okay, I'm just not as adapted to the modern society as everyone else. Anyways, so Federalist 10. Let's take a chance to look at this. All right. So, among the numerous advantages promoted by a well-constructed union of states in the form of a strong central government, none deserves to be more accurately developed than its ability to break and control the violence of faction. So what is a faction?
I watched the video, but I was really confused as to what a group of people like
or
the same
organization.
ideas that group together.
Yes, a group of people with the same ideas. So if we were to think in terms of modern factions, what modern factions can you think of? Okay, are all Republicans thinking the same? What do Republicans differ on? Okay, meaning what?
Something like gay rights.
Okay, gay rights would be one, because you could have Republicans that are what we call business Republicans that are like, I take anybody's money, I don't care, right? I don't care what they do as long as their money's spent. Okay? And they, for them, this is a non-issue, right? But then you've got other people for whom this is a moral issue, and this fosters immorality, and our government should be moral. It should be a moral leadership, right? And so they see this as a real conflict. Those are factions within the same party. So factions are groups of people that believe different things. Now, does that mean that we all sit in our camps and refuse to talk to each other? It's not supposed to, anyways. Certainly, typically, in the case of American politics, the way our system is structured, we're supposed to have to compromise. Okay? Now, in European politics, you don't have to compromise because they have this parliamentary system where you can vote for whatever party you have, and whichever party gets the most votes is going to get certain percentage of the seats in Parliament. This is how your far right party in Germany got like 100 seats. So yeah, your far right party in Germany that wants to redefine the meaning of World War II and Adolf Hitler, FYI, okay, gained 100 seats in Parliament, in Merkel's Parliament. So in Europe, factions work differently because factions actually participate in government. The coalition building comes actually within the parliamentary system. In America, the compromise part comes in developing our party platforms. So we have political factions within the parties, and we agree on what we stand for. Now, how does this create chaos? Well, look at the 2016 election. How many presidential candidates did we have? 4. In some places you've had 5. People didn't vote for president, but they voted for everybody else. Like, you had all kinds of craziness. So this is kind of what you see happening. You have people writing in candidates. I mean, so yeah, so in the 2016 election, the faction system did not work the way it was supposed to. Okay, because what it was supposed to do was we were supposed to get together as Republicans or as Democrats, and yes, we would have factions. The Democratic Party has factions too. You have your progressive faction, you have your Bernie Sanders faction, you've got your kind of mainstream Democrats, you know, and
So are factions kind of subgroups?
yes, they're subgroups within a political party. He goes on to say, by faction I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent interests of the community. So in other words, not everybody in the community agrees. Take, for instance, we could argue immigration. Okay? Republican Party, as it's construed under Donald Trump, advocates for a hard line on immigration. That is a profound shift from the Republican Party. Now, I'm a political junkie, so I probably understand this in a way not everybody does. But even you guys, with just kind of a superficial kind of, oh yeah, I'm kind of aware of what's going on, you understand that the current Republican Party wants to limit immigration, right? They just counter-offered, we'll let the dreamers stay if you build a wall and if you don't allow any more refugees from Central America. And so this is kind of the new policy that's out there. Why do you think that is a dramatic switch? What role does immigration have as far as businesses?
The lower kind of jobs that the immigrants have.
Yeah, well, do they take jobs or do they do
No,
jobs
they do the jobs that no one else wants.
that nobody else wants? And they're cheap, right? So it's good for business and it provides more consumers, right? So typically, the Republican Party as a business kind of, party has always favored immigration, right? So for years, immigration has been kind of a middle of the road policy that both Democrats embraced and Republicans embraced. It hasn't been until about the last 8 years that you've started to see the Republican Party switch. So one could argue that within the Republican Party, your anti-immigrant, the ones who want to build the wall, the Trump base of people that pundits talk about, that their interests are not really what's best for the economy. Now, there's other nuances to what they're arguing, right? I mean, they're arguing cultural impacts and impact on social services, and there's real specifics to that. So I'm kind of painting with a broad brush here, but understand that that's kind of what we're talking about. There are two methods of curing the mischiefs of faction, the one by removing its causes, the other by controlling its effects. The most common and durable source of factions has been the various and unequal distribution of property. What does that mean?
They aren't giving out property the same to everyone.
Okay, so why does that encourage factions?
People would want
Yeah, it's about inequality versus equality.
the people with lots of property versus like no property.
Yes, and didn't we just see that in the constitutional role play? Okay? That people think in terms of enslaved African Americans. They wanted certain things that, were not in the best interest of the Southern planters. But the Southern planters wanted things that were not in the best interest of enslaved African Americans. Think about the farmers and the workers. Right? So you've got factions that create based on similar interests. And those factions sometimes butt heads. And oftentimes the root problem is who owns what? Who owns how much? Okay? And that's, it's always about economy and economic security. And those things create issues. Those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed distinct interests. Oops. Come on. Ah, stop it. Oh, poo. Fiddlesticks. Where'd you go? Where'd you go? Where'd you go? No. There we go. It's opening. There we go. All right. Let's start over. Not start over, but go back to that part. All right. Where are we? Those who hold and those who are without property have ever formed distinct interests in society. Those who are creditors and those who are debtors fall under a like discrimination. A landed interest and manufacturing interest with many lesser interests grow up of necessity in civilized nations and divide them into different sentiments and views. The regulation of these various and interfering interests form the principal task of modern legislation and involves the spirit of party and faction in the necessary and ordinary operations of government. What does that mean?
The government's there to keep like everyone's best interests.
Mm-hmm.
It's federalist, really.
With everyone's best interests, and it's the landed property interests that, yes, they form factions, but their factions tend to promote the general goodwill. You can tell Madison's a property owner, right? You don't trust those people without property because their interests are very different, and therefore, right, good government's tied to the people that have property because their interests are going to tend to promote the most good for everybody. Then he goes on to say, it is vain to say that enlightened statesmen will be able to adjust these clashing interests and render them all subservient to the public good. So it can't just be one person. You can't just assume you're always going to have good men in charge, because that's not always going to happen, right? And you're assuming that men with property will always put other people's interests ahead of their own from time to time. And that's not always going to be the case. So how do we resolve that? Okay? Enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm, nor in many cases can such an adjustment be made at all without taking into view indirect and remote considerations which will rarely prevail over the immediate interest which one party may find in disregarding the rights of another or the good of a whole. So what are they? So he's saying what? People get greedy. Like ideally, landed people with property will promote the general goodwill because they'll understand that even if this one policy or this one compromise doesn't benefit me as much as I would like, it's better for everybody, and long term that's going to benefit me. Short term maybe not, but long term it will. But that's assuming that they're always going to be enlightened statesmen. Most of them will not, and you can't count on that, right? You can't count on your FDRs of the world, right, that are going to come in who was raised with money and basically advocates for redistribution of wealth. Okay, it's a little strong, but certainly conservative people would argue he advocated for that. So, I mean, not everybody's going to do that kind of thing. So, how do you handle that? They're going to get greedy, and they're going to want to keep as much as they can. The inference to which we are brought is that the causes of faction cannot be removed, and that relief is to be sought in the means of controlling its effects. We're never going to solve factions. We are always going to have different opinions. We're always going to be greedy. We're always going to be convinced our way is the right way. We're always going to sit there in our group. We're going to, and in today's terminology, we'll get on Facebook or Twitter or whatever. Or you guys, Snapchat's not very good for that kind of thing. I mean, Snapchat's good for like screaming about something. I'm so frustrated with this class. I hate this federal STEM paper. And I know because I've been on Snapchat about my class. Not this class, but my graduate class. So anyway, so I know how it goes. I know. Anyways, but so you get in those like-minded groups. Take for instance the dual credit government class that's been doing debates. They will tend to congregate in like-minded groups. That's what we do. We're not, that's not going to change because we say ideally we shouldn't sit in factions, because we're always going to be attracted to those things. So how do we find a way to fix the causes? Because we're not going to stop the fact that it happens. By what means is this relief attainable? Evidently, by one of two ways only. Either the existence of the interest in a majority must be prevented, or the majority, having such coexistent passion or interest, must be rendered by their number and local situation, and able to concert and carry into effect schemes of oppression. If the impulse and the opportunity to be suffered to coincide, we will know that neither moral nor religious motives can be relied on as adequate control of the masses. What does that mean? Yes, limit the greedy people's power. And to suggest that morality or religious motivations are going to make people behave, that's not going to happen, right? People will find a way to justify their own greed and deeds. Always, 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 always. They will wrap it in whatever they need to so that it looks pretty, right? They'll put lipstick on a pig, is how the saying goes, right? And say, this is, and so, they'll find a way to justify what they're doing. From this view of the subject, it may be concluded that a pure democracy can admit of no cure for the mischiefs of faction. Democracy, where one person, where we all take a vote, the parliamentary system, right? We all take a vote for our faction, right? And we have 51% vote one way and 49% vote the other way. What are you going to do, right? That majority, that simple majority, is going to tend to promote this kind of oppression. So he's going to say, a common passion or interest will, in almost every case, be felt by a majority of the whole. Hence it is such that democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and disagreement, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or rights of property, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. Remember, Madison spends years studying every example of democracy and republic as he's coming up with the ideas for the Constitution. Like, seriously, this is a dude that was going to college when he was like 16, okay? Super smart. Reads Greek, reads Latin, reads all this kind of stuff. Jefferson's over in France sending him books about republics and democracy. So he doesn't say this because he's just pulling it out, right? He's saying this because he studied it. This is what history has shown. We cannot trust democracies in that simple majority. There has to be some kind of buffer, because otherwise people will be left to their own greedy interests, being convinced that they are right, and they will find whatever justifications they can that they are right. A republic, by which I mean, a republic, by which I mean a government in which the scheme of representation takes place, opens a different prospect and promises the cure for which we are seeking. Let us examine the points in which it varies from pure democracy, and we shall comprehend both the nature of the cure and the effectiveness which it must derive from the union. So, representation, not direct democracy, but electing a representative that then has to take his interests. And so if we were to elect a representative and we elected Garrett would have to take the interests of all of us. Even though some of us favor, vanilla ice cream, and some of us favor chocolate ice cream, and we've got one person that wants pistachio. He's going to have to come and say, do I have a pistachio fan? I didn't just happen to look over there. I really didn't know. So Garrett's going to have to come up with a way to find a kind of ice cream that the different factions are going to agree with. And Garrett, it's all on you. I guess you're going to Brahms now. Garrett's like, yeah, okay, I'll go. The two great points of difference between a democracy and a republic are, first, the power in a republic is delegated to a small number of citizens, and a republic can be extended over a larger country and can include a greater number of citizens. So in other words, a democracy can only get so big, right? But the idea of representation means we can account for a growing population and we can account for differing interests, right? So different regions can have different interests and they can, answer to that. Now, here's the question you should think. How is that working now? How did that work, well, we haven't gotten to the Civil War yet, but certainly if you think about now. You know that in the election of 2016, we had what they call blue islands, right? Basically, in red states like Texas, you had islands of blue, which are cities like Dallas and Austin and Houston that voted blue. Okay, but the rest of the state voted red. So the electors went to the Republican Party. Even though the blue islands have representatives, they are outnumbered by the number of red. Okay, so here's the dilemma. We have a large state. We have a large number of citizens. We have large concentrations of citizens in Dallas, Houston, and Austin. But how does that practically happen? How does that translate into government? How does the government manage that? What does this say for your blue islands? Do they feel like they have representation at the state level? Probably not. And, I probably tend to belong to more progressive Facebook groups. But that being said, I know from the groups I associate with that there's a sense that our interests aren't represented, right? What do? I mean, it's the system. It's representative. We have representatives that go down there and say the things we want to say. Maybe not everything we want to say, or maybe we're not crazy about some of the things. But by and large, what good does it do in a red state like Texas? Okay. So this is the dilemma with factions. So he's arguing that the representative system will work because they'll be able to balance those interests.
So it's kind of like Congress, or having like more Republicans in Congress.
Yes. And of course, part of this, kind of an asterisk next to this. One of the things that Madison doesn't account for is what we call gerrymandering, where they draw district lines in weird ways so that certain votes don't count, right? Now, in Texas, Texas is one of the states that has been affected by gerrymandering. So the case that's before the Supreme Court right now involves Texas, right, as well as Wisconsin. So you've got, and I don't know. I'm not sure you can do anything about the Blue Islands in Texas. It just is. You can't help the fact that the majority of Texas is still very rural. And that difference is going to exist as long as Texas is rural. There is some gerrymandering happening in certain places, especially in the rural areas. But when you're talking about the Blue Islands of the cities, I'm not sure there's much you can do about that. Because, it's pretty clear they're voting blue, majority-wise. And so really, within the city politics, and if you know anybody that's, votes in the Dallas city elections, they feel like their vote, if they're conservative, they feel like their votes are ignored. Because there were people that didn't want Mike Rollins to be mayor, and he got voted in. Right. Now, typically in mayoral elections, it's not so much DNR, it's more just kind of person. But Rollins tends to be somewhat more progressive-minded, right? Your example is removing the Confederate monuments. And that's a city government thing. So your conservative elements are going to feel like they don't have a voice at the city level. So it's not perfect, right? And this is the dilemma, right? So he's talking about in a perfect world, this is how it's supposed to work. The effect of the first difference is, on one hand, to refine and enlarge the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens, whose wisdom may best choose the true interest of their country, and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations of change. Under such a regulation, it may well happen that the public voice, pronounced by the representatives of the people, will be more consistent to the public good than if pronounced by the people themselves. What is that helping? Yes. Notice this laundry list of people. Okay, remember, this is the ideal situation. A body of citizens whose wisdom may best choose the true interest of their country, whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary impartial considerations of change. So he's making an assumption that the representatives, that the people will choose the best possible representative. Do we think that's true? And that's up to you guys to decide. I mean, first off, we all have, I live in a different district, but the other part of it too is it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if I feel like my representatives have wisdom and love justice. I go vote based on whether I think that. But the problem is, what if the majority of people see it very differently? How does that work? How do we balance all those interests? And I don't know. I mean, it's tricky, right? The other point of difference is the greater number of citizens and extent of territory which may be bought within the compass of Republican than of democratic government, and it is this circumstance principally which renders factions less to be dreaded in the former than in the latter. Okay? The greater number of citizens and extent of territory which may be brought within the compass of Republican rather than democratic government. We can be bigger. We can grow. Okay? The smaller the society, the fewer probably will be in distinct parties and interests composing it. The fewer the distinct parties and interests, the more frequently will be a majority to be found of the same party, and the smaller the number of individuals composing a majority, and the smaller the compass within which they are placed, the more easily they will concert and execute their plans of oppression. So the smaller we are, the fewer people there are, the less differences there are, right? If we all live in a really small area, if we all live in Rhode Island, remember Rhode Island doesn't send anybody to the Constitutional Convention, everybody in Rhode Island, they all think exactly the same. That's kind of where he's going with this, right? Whereas someplace like Virginia, where you've got people on the frontier and people on the coast, so he's seen this in his own lifetime, with how the larger the area, the more you have a difference of opinion. Let's see, extend the sphere and you take in a greater variety of parties and interests. You make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens, or if such a common motive exists, it will be more difficult for all who feel it to discover their own strength and to act in unison with each other. And where there is a consciousness of unjust or dishonorable purposes, communication is always checked by distrust in proportion to the number whose agreement is necessary. So what is he saying there? If we add more people, we add more differences of opinion, we're less likely to get on the same page. We're going to, kind of distrust each other. We're going to have to compromise with each other. We're going to have to reach a consensus because we're different enough, okay? Hence, it clearly appears that the same advantage which a republic has over a democracy in controlling the effects of factions is enjoyed by a large over a small republic, is enjoyed by a strong central government over the states composing the Union. In other words, the states are the ones that are subject to factions. I mentioned the Blue Islands in Texas. To what extent is that what we see even in Texas? And Texas is a large state, right? So when you start to have this idea of state governments where you have, this majority of people that can really kind of coalesce the views, that's when you start to run into issues. Now, if you started listening to some of the lectures, I talk about, the states' rights argument and how it begins to emerge. So how does the states' right argument kind of factor into that? That's kind of an interesting element of it. The influence of factious leaders may kindle a flame within their particular states, but will be unable to spread a general conflagration through the other states. A rage for paper money, for an abolition of debts, for an equal division of property, or for other improper or wicked project will be less apt to pervade the whole body of the Union than a particular member of it. in the same proportion as such a malady is more likely to taint a particular county or district than an entire state. And the extent, the proper structure of the Union, therefore, we behold a Republican remedy for the diseases most incident to Republican government. What does he call a wicked and improper project? Look at what he lists out. Paper money, abolition of debts, equal division of property. These are all economic interests. Okay? Remember, Madison's a property owner. Private wealth. The government exists to protect private wealth. Okay? So, interesting dilemma, right? You have Madison, and of course, understand this is just one of a bunch of the Federalist Papers. Yeah, I mean, so this is just one. And there's some places where the Federalist Papers contradict themselves. Now, ultimately, he's talking specifically about things that relate to what we talked about in our role play. Abolition of debts, currency, that kind of thing. So he's talking specifically about the state issues at the time. And what he's pointing to is that those state issues are creating havoc. And this is why you need a strong central government to balance these interests between the states for the good of the whole country. Okay. Notice he says the influence of factious leaders. So, again, factions. What are factions? Does that help you a little bit? So if you go back to the prompt, what you see, explain Madison's ideas about government, republic versus democracy. What are factions? How do they function? Then analyze how our current political environment measures up to Madison's ideas. What are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? And I mean, arguably, Madison is talking about the ideal. He's talking about an ideal situation based on information he has in 1787 or 1788, whatever. That's what he's making the case for. So, I mean, can we argue that maybe it's a little out of context? Perhaps, except it's Madison, the man who wrote the Constitution, basically. So we can give a little bit of weight to his words, to what he's saying about how we balance these issues. So in analyzing what he has to say about factions and democracy and how that's supposed to work and how do we balance these issues, is there a remedy for what we fail to be doing now, right? I mean, there you go. So does that help? Okay. All right, well, good. So I recorded that for fifth period. Hello, fifth period. So that way they would have something, since